professor and a professional archaeologist, works at Henderson State with the Henderson State University Archaeological Research Station, which is one of 9 archaeological research stations in the state of Arkansas, part of the Arkansas Archaeological Survey. And if she were just doing that, it would be amazing. But part of Dr. Trubitt's skill set is that she is able to talk with regular people like us who are fascinated by the work. And so she also is in charge of the Ouachita chapter of the Arkansas Archaeological Society. And they also have a monthly speaker series. If you want to know more, you can certainly plug that at the end. And so we are fortunate in Arkansas that for the last 26 years, Dr. Trubitt has been here not only learning about the deep history of this place and becoming one of, if not the leading experts on the archaeology of the Caddo people in whose homeland we are currently standing, but also she wants to tell that story to the rest of us in as many ways as possible. And if you go online, you'll see that this is not her first rodeo. She's constantly accepting invitations to give presentations all around this region. So we are fortunate that you are not only dedicated to the craft, but you're dedicated to the community and telling the story. So wealth of knowledge, but also a guide and mentor to many and committed to that community knowledge. So thank you very much, Dr. Trubitt, for lending us your talents.
I can't get you to sit over here in the lifetime. I'll tell you when to switch slides. That way I'll walk back and forth in front of the screen and so yes, I'm Mary Beth Trubitt, and today we're going to learn about some of the earlier history of the Ouachita region, and not just the part, but the Garland County and surrounding Ouachita region. We have a lot of history. We have hundreds of generations that have lived here in the past. And so how do we go about learning that deep history of this area? Let's go ahead and, okay, so first, who's here? Where are they now? If we look at a map of Arkansas, a current map of Arkansas, if we look, say, circa 1700 AD, we would have 4 main groups of indigenous people living here, the Caddos in the southwestern part of the state, the Tunica and Corolla in the southeastern part of the state, and the Mississippi River. Quapaw had villages mainly at the mouth of the Arkansas River where it flows into the Mississippi River. The Osage, most of their communities were in Missouri, but they occupied a lot of northern Arkansas, down northern Arkansas. So Osage and Quapaw, Tunica, and Caddo. And around here, there was a community of Caddo, ancestors of the Caddo. So, slide. So, we have a lot of history of the Caddos and their ancestors living here in this region. How do we learn about this history? How do we learn about this first 10,000 years? We have a couple of different sources of information: written records, oral history, archaeology. All of these go into telling us this story of this deep history. And it works best if we use all of them in conjunction, because each of them has their pluses and minuses, their advantages and their disadvantages. Of course, I'm an archaeologist, so I come with that bias. I come from that perspective. And you should know that. I think like an archaeologist. But all 3 of these are good sources of information. So let's look a little more in particular. So written records. We have written descriptions of Caddo communities by early Spanish and French visitors to what is now Arkansas and Louisiana. This is a 1719 map of the Louisiana area, just what is now the state of Louisiana area, by Guillermo Delisle. The French and the Spanish that were here beginning in the 1500s, but especially in the late 1600s and into the 1700s, interacted with the Caddo communities and wrote about that experience. Of course, they're writing from their own perspective, so they have a certain perspective there as well. They They describe several distinct groups of Caddo communities in this area. The Natchitoches, the Caddo, the Inyo, the Hasidic, different groups with different styles, but all speaking the Caddo language. So we had different political groups. There was not a unified group calling themselves the Caddo until more recently, until the 1800s. So cultural similarity, but political variation across this broad area. So we have oral history. Many people learn their history by listening to their elders tell stories about what happened in the past. And Caddos are still doing this today. So we have here images of the Caddo culture club during the Turkey days back in 2006. The song cycle in Caddo that accompanies the Turkey days tells us specific historic events that happened before 1800. And by recounting, by singing these songs, by doing the turkey dance, the Caddos are continuing this historical tradition and teaching younger members of the nation this tradition, this history, so carrying along this heritage and this history in an oral manner. Yeah. And then we have archaeology. Archaeologists look at the material traces of past human activities. So we're looking at the places where people live, the places where these various activities took place, and looking at the material remnants of these activities to learn about what people were doing there, how people lived, what people ate, how people worshiped, how people interacted with their neighbors. We can learn this and answer these questions if we carefully document these archaeological sites and record what we find where. It's the relationships between things and the places where we're finding is going to give us this information. And of course, nowadays we have new technologies that we can use. We use GPS, we use LiDAR, we use geophysical surveying, and learn more about these important places in the past. So we use each of these sources of information. Right? So we have a long history here, thousands of years. We have history going back at least 13,000 years here from archaeologists come up with these names of different periods. The archaeologists made these up. At the time, we're not calling themselves old. They were not calling themselves archaic. They were calling themselves contemporary. But these are the breakdown. This is the breakdown that archaeologists do. We have at least 13,000 years of history here. What we're interested in is asking and answering questions about what happened across these thousands of years. So, how long have people been here? How do people adapt to changes in their environment? How did people trade and interact with other groups beyond their area, or were they just isolated in their own communities? Where did people first decide to start domesticating plants to grow crops for food? Why make that change? Why in certain times and places do we see more increase in population and an increase in complexity in the organization for organizing their communities. What do we see as effects of the interaction between Native people and the European visitors to this area beginning in the 1500s in the De Soto expedition? What were the effects of that interaction? So we have a number of questions that we can pose and look at. I'm going to take you through kind of a chronological breakdown, hopefully talking a little bit about some of these questions. So earliest time period, we can look at what archaeologists call Paleoindian time period, 11,500 to 8,500 BC. We have limited information here in Arkansas about this old time period. Many Native people will say, well, we've always been here. Based on the archaeology, we have physical traces, the stone tips of spear points that are clearly humanly made, that are as old as 11,500. I brought in for you to take a look at the clear crystal Clovis point that we have in our collections in Arkadelphia. It came from a site here in Garland County. That's the oldest thing we have there at the office, so I brought that in to show. Here in Arkansas, we do find examples of these various styles of spear points. We have to look a little further afield to see examples of now extinct animals like mammoths and mastodons with spear points in them, in the bones of these now extinct animals that were here during the Pleistocene, here during the late Pleistocene Ice Age, but have gone extinct since then. So we do see some traces of these early populations. Populations must have been relatively small and relatively mobile because we don't have a whole lot of information. The picture gets a little better when we talk about the shift between the Pleistocene and the Holocene, end of the Ice Age and the beginning of the Holocene geological era that we're in right now. Climate is changing, and we have, again, stone spear points to base our interpretations on. But we have more evidence, and in particular, I highlight some excavations that Roger Coleman did on the Ouachita National Forest at a site in Pike County, where he found a number of these Dalton-style points at the site that he interpreted as a retooling station. People would throw away the broken ones and make new ones in order to retool. In particular, maybe using cane that was grown in the area as part of that weapon system. These are not just stone, but they were attached to handles, which were perishable. We don't see the handles anymore, but they would have been an important part of that too. Okay, then we have this long period of time that the archaeologists call the Archaic period, 8,500 to 1,000 BC. Thousands of years, many generations of people living during this long time period. For much of this time period, people around here are hunting and fishing, collecting wild plants for food, so wild plants and animals used for food. By the end of this Archaic time period, people are growing crops. They've domesticated a suite of plants and are growing crops intentionally in this area. Initially, communities are pretty mobile, but during this time span, in some places, certain time periods, people are living in settled communities, year-round communities, and then by the end of this Archaic period, people are building more elaborate sites and building mounds, earthworks at some of these sites. So it's a long time period with a lot of change. And it's a time period that I've been interested in looking at. So our excavations at the Jones Mill site, which is outside of Hot Springs, near Jones Mill, was focusing in on Archaic, and especially Middle Archaic time period, about 6,000 to 4,300 BC. At that time, the rivers had stabilized, and people are settling in communities near those rivers, like the Ouachita River here. We, in our excavations, this was a project, it was a collaborative project between the Archaeological Survey and the Archaeological Society. We were focusing excavations in order to learn about who was living there at the time and what was their involvement in navaculi, tool making, stone tool making, and the trade and exchange of stone tools made out of this important resource. What we found was a lot of stone tools, a lot of stone tool making debris, the industrial waste from this industry, and tools that indicated hunting, like again, the stone ones, and things like these net sinkers, notched metal net sinkers, which would have weighed down fishing nets. So fishing, hunting, plant processing. We found a lot of charred hickory nutshell, not a whole lot of black walnut, but a lot of hickory nutshell in this horizon. We didn't find any houses of this time period, but the features that we found were piles of burned rock. I'm so excited about burned rock. Well, at this time, this is before people had invented pottery, people were using a lot of indirect cooking techniques. So dig a pit, build a fire in the pit with some rock down in that pit to hold the heat of that fire, wait for the fire to burn down, and on those coals, lay in your packages of meat or whatever food you're doing, and let it slow bake, slow cook for a day, and then uncover it. When you uncover it, you're going to toss out those rocks. The rocks is not what you're interested in, it's the food you're interested in. The rocks are a byproduct of the cooking facility. And so we are, while we didn't find traces of actual houses, we did find a place where people are cooking. So, we actually we did some residue analysis on some of these fire-cracked rocks and found lipid analysis. Lipids are oils from plants and animals. We found nut seed oils and cholesterol from animals. It wasn't specific enough to tell us what kinds of animals, but we're using these cooking facilities to cook plants and animals at that time. Okay, next slide. So the archaic time period is the time period in particular when people are using a lot of navaculi. Arkansas navaculi is the stone that we nowadays will use it as a whetstone. But back in the day, it was the raw material for making all those stone tools. And I brought in some for you to take a look at after the talk. So navaculi is the local tool stone resource of outcrops on the mountain ridges in and around Hot Springs. And there are major quarries on these mountain ridges where people obtained this raw material. They would then bring pieces of it down to their home bases down near the river, like at Jones Mill, and make the rock into whatever kind of tool they needed. With this Arkansas Navaculi website, we've been trying to track the the distribution of this. So we know where the quarry sites are in the Ouachita Mountains, and we're trying to track where Navacula went to, where it ended up. So I have people who contact me and say, I think I have a Navacula arrowhead. I'm down in Louisiana. I say, okay, great. We'll take a look at your picture, add that data point to our map. We find that Navacula was during the Middle and Late Archaic periods was traded down into Louisiana, down into Mississippi, areas where we don't have such good rock as we do. And we can track the interaction of people, we can track the movement of the rock itself and the tools made out of this rock, and use that as a proxy for the interaction between people, the flow of ideas, the flow of people, the movement of people. Turns out that the Ouachita Mountains was not a backwater. It was a region that was connected with a much broader area, thousands of years in the past, which I think is pretty cool. Put a QR code on there for you to check out the website and learn more about the Navacula. That's pretty cool. All right. So by the end of the Archaic period and what archaeologists call the Woodland period, we see a number of changes. We see some technological changes. We have about 1000 BC, the earliest pottery here in Arkansas. Not the earliest in the world, but the earliest here in Arkansas was about 1000 BC. We have a suite of crops that people are farming, and to be sure, the grains that people are farming must have changed the food recipes that people are using, and the invention of pottery goes along with changes in these cooking traditions. We also have, during the Woodland time period, a change from spear points or dart points, thrown darts, to bow and arrow. Wheel points, bow and arrow technology. And we have smaller points. Around here, people will talk to lead points. Well, they're just going to do it. Just different technology, more recent technology that comes in around 600 BC and very rapidly changes the hunting method that we see. The farming is an interesting story. So many people don't know this, but unless you took the archaeology class, so there are something like 6 or 7 independent centers of domestication in the world. 6 or 7 places that we can isolate in the world where people invented plant domestication, and then it spread from there to other neighboring areas. One of those centers for plant domestication is Arkansas, Mississippi River Valley at Arkansas. So we have a suite of crops that was domesticated here, beginning about 2000 BC. So in the late Archaic period, but they then become very important during the Woodland period, 2000 BC, 2000 BC. These are crops like squash, which we still use today, sunflower we still use today. But some of these crops we're not as familiar with. Little barley, maygrass, marsh elder, Caddo. Caddo is kind of interesting because nowadays you can get quinoa in some stores or in ancient grain cereal or something like that. Quinoa. Quinoa is the quinoa we have today is grown in South America. There was a local version, a local variant of that, that's Quinoa, that was domesticated here beginning of the late Archaic period and used throughout the Woodland period. And then it declines and disappears, and it's now, we don't see this in domesticated crop here, but it was in the past. So we have this whole suite of oily seeded and starchy seeded grains that were domesticated and grown locally thousands of years before people started growing corn. And that corn became the main key staple crop that was grown here. That still is right. The Plum Bayou Mounds State Park preserves an archaeological site where a lot of this research has gone on, because Plum Bayou is a late Woodland period site. And next slide, the society training program will be held at Plum Bayou Mounds State Park near Woodland again this June. The society will serve every June training program in archaeology. It is a way for people who are interested in archaeology to learn about archaeology, to participate in professional research alongside professional archaeologists, and work in the field, work in the lab. There's a series of seminars that take place over the 2 weeks. And the training program is held at a different place depending on who's doing what research. And this year it will be at Plum Bayou Late Woodland period mound center, ceremonial center near Arkansas. So the training program is open to people who are society members, so if you're interested, check it out. We'll see you there. Great. Okay. So one of the training programs that I ran was a field project at a site in Montgomery County called Dragover. It's a site that's on the Ouachita National Forest, and this research was done. Nick Subsistence and I co-directed the project. It was a collaborative project between Arkansas Archaeological Survey, Arkansas Archaeological Society, and the Ouachita National Forest. The site is a site near the Ouachita River. It is a large site, so 10 hectares. It is a site where people came and lived off and on for thousands of years. It was a good location to live, and we have evidence of people living there from the Dalton culture, circa 8500 BC, all the way to the settlers who were there in the late 1800s, early 1900s, before the Ouachita National Forest purchased the property. So we have a long history of people living there. And we had a number of questions that we were asking during this research, because we were interested in stone tool making and stone tool use and trade of vernaculite and other raw materials. We were interested in early domestication of crops. We were interested in the Caddo history as well. So we had a couple of different questions for a couple of different time periods. We did find some evidence of early domesticates. We got a bit of charred squash that dated to 825 AD. But this is not the oldest domesticates that we find in Garland County. There's a project, Arkansas Transportation Project, north of Hot Springs, that ended up documenting charred seeds from domesticated Chenopodium, marsh elder, knotweed, baygrass, and tobacco, which is that tobacco domesticated as old as 1450 BC. So back in the late Archaic period. So we're increasing our database of early domestication of crops here in the Ouachita Mountains. All right, next slide. So we've got a number of foods that are important. Wild resources like a variety of nuts, fruits, domesticated crops, including Chenopodium, tropical cultigens. The maize and beans are first domesticated in Central and South America. People bring the crops and the knowledge of farming the crops into the Southwest, and eventually into this region as well. After about 80, 900, or 1,000, that we see corn as an important crop here. Indeed, somewhat later. Squash is earlier, but maize is later. Wild animals, deer, then as now, people continue to rely on hunting deer around here. And fishing. I live near Lake DeGray, and I can tell you this week is active fishing week. Lots of boats heading towards the lakes right now. We ended up, the Ouachita chapter of the Arkansas Archaeological Society ended up writing a children's book based on our work at Dragover and circulating it to second grade classrooms in the counties in Ouachita Mountains. And I brought a copy of it to show as well. Great, thanks. So we know much more about the Mississippian period, what archaeologists call the Mississippian period, what we here in this area of the state would call the Caddo period, because it's this time period that we have the best information about ancestral Caddos. The Caddos lived in an area a large area that covers part of Arkansas, part of Louisiana, part of Texas, and part of Oklahoma. The Ouachita Mountains is an important area within this Caddo area because what we see is an area that's in between the Caddo communities that would have been in the Arkansas River Valley to the north and the Caddo communities that would have been in the Red River Valley to the south. Movement, interaction between these areas would have gone through the Ouachita Mountains. The Caddos, ancestral Caddos by this time are sedentary farming folks living in year-round villages near their farm fields. These communities were spread out along river valleys in this area. Rather than having everyone crammed together into a compact town, there were dispersed farmsteads spread out so people were living closer to their fields. But communities would be focused, centered around a mound center that would be the place where the religious and political leadership would live. And these communities would be part of that center, even if they were not physically there at that particular mound site. Based on later descriptions by the Spanish and the French, these Caddo communities were based on households that were made up of several related families. The kin groups were ranked in terms of social status, and not everyone had the same social status. They were hierarchical in that the leadership came from the highest ranked kin group. The people in Arkansas at this time built mounds. They buried their dead in cemeteries. They made pottery, often beautifully decorated pottery. They used bow and arrow. We've got pictures of arrow points up here. I don't have to scale, but little points rather than big points. The Caddos were very sophisticated. They had a significant influence on this region in the centuries prior to European colonization. Next. Like I said, the communities are, the political system was hierarchical. The mound centers included mounds that had buildings that were used by the political and the religious leadership. One of the important sites in this area is the Adair site in Garland County, now under Lake Ouachita. But during the 1930s, actually 1939, there were WPA excavations at the site, Works Progress Administration excavations at the site before it was inundated by Lake Ouachita. The excavations uncovered the footprint of large buildings, including large circular structures that were built similar to this reconstructed grass house at Caddo State Historic Site in Texas. There were several mounds at the site, one of which the main mound was trenched, and this is the colored pencil drawing showing what they saw in the wall of that trench. What they saw was traces of burned buildings. So there was a series of buildings that were erected and used, and then when they were finished, they collapsed them down into the burn intentionally, and then covered them up again and built another building. So you have a series of these buildings that were undoubtedly used for the residents and the religious practices of the leadership. Not all the houses looked like this, but some of them were treated in this specific way. And this artist reconstruction shows this kind of use and burning of buildings on a map like this. The records, the notes, the photographs, the artifacts from the WPA Adair excavations are curated at the University of Arkansas Museum in Fayetteville. We see something similar, sort of similar at the Dragover site. Dragover did not have any mound, but we did uncover traces of several buildings. Most complete one was a circular building. What we saw was the traces of the post holes in a circular pattern. The structure at Dragover dated to the early 1400s. At the Jones Mill site, we also had part of a building that again dated to the early 1400s. This time period was an active time period in this area. Lots of communities, lots of Caddo communities and activity by the ancestral Caddos. There were problems ahead. So I looked at the North American drought atlas. We're now able to do some environmental reconstruction for centuries around the 1400s in this area of the Ouachita Mountains. Using this drought atlas, we found that there is an extended period of drought between 1450 and 1458, 8 years of severe drought. Now, for farming people, you expect that there's going to be year-to-year variation, seasonal variation, like frosts, flooding, drought, and deal with it. But 8 years of severe drought is going to impact farmers living in this area. And there may well have been people leaving the community. There may well have been political instability. There may well have been changes in subsistence practices, people going to less favored foods, or maybe using more drought-resistant varieties of corn. At the Dragover site, if people left, they were surely back by 1500. Next slide. Because we have in a different area at the Dragover site, we excavated 2 big trash pits. Again, why are you interested in trash? Well, that's what people leave behind. That's what people leave behind. So pits filled with refuse that included animal bone, and mussel shell, and stone tools, and big pieces of broken pots, swept up into these trash pits. This particular one, we were able to get a radiocarbon date on charred corn seed, corn kernel. That gives us a date of 1500. We have another one similar to this. We had a date of 1650. So I've used these dates to bracket a new archaeological phase for the Ouachita Mountains, what we call the Hadashka phase. I reached out to the Caddo Nation, and Alea Tali, who is the language preservationist for the Caddo Nation, gave me the name of Hadashka. Hadashka meaning tough and unyielding. Kanpan referred to times. So tough, unyielding times. Referring not only to the tough times that people were going through, that communities going through, but also their perseverance, their toughness in continuing there at the Dragover site, despite the conditions in the 1450s, despite the disruption that undoubtedly surrounded the Spanish expedition of Hernando de Soto coming through Arkansas in the 1540s, continuing at this site and other sites in the Ouachita Mountains for at least 1650. Next slide. So by 1700, we see that local Caddo families have moved out of the area to join other communities, other Caddo communities, either further south of the Ouachita River, further south in the Red River Valley. Perhaps some went up to the Arkansas River Valley and joined communities there at Caddo Bottoms. By the late 1600s, early 1700s, the Spanish had come into the area. Spanish come in, interested in missionizing. The French came in. The French were interested in trade, and they were quite happy to tap into these long-established trade networks that the Caddos had in this area. During the 1700s, we have population decline, mainly because of the effects of introduced diseases that people weren't used to and weren't immune to, didn't have any resistance to. There's also disruption because there were other groups of people coming in, native people from east of the Mississippi River, and non-native people coming into the area too. Even before the Indian Removal Act, we have Cherokees coming into Arkansas. So there's a lot of flux at this time in the 1700s. In the 1800s is a real period of decline for Caddo. There's a series of treaties with the Quapaw, treaties with the Caddo, and the Caddo are ceded land in Arkansas and moved out into Texas in Texas, they ran into a lot of trouble. And after a series of crop failures and attacks by white settlers in Texas, they are forced to move into Indian territory. In Indian territory, it was now Oklahoma. The Caddos initially had a reservation. The reservation was allotted out to individuals as part of the Dawes Allotment Act legislation. So there is no Caddo reservation there anymore. People established households on their allotments, but the reservation is not there anymore. Late 1800s is a real tough time for Native people. A lot of children were taken from home and moved to off-reservation boarding schools where conditions were dire. And people were prohibited, kids were prohibited from speaking their native languages. The dire conditions eventually caused enough of a public outcry that we had reforms in the early 20th century, leading to the 1934 Indian Reorganization Act. And following that, the Caddo Nation, the Caddo organized their own elected tribal council and began reorganizing tribal governance. So today, the Caddo Nation of Oklahoma is based in Oklahoma, in Bayer, Oklahoma. And next slide. And continues today. So we still have Caddos. Caddo community is active now. Most people live in Oklahoma, but they're interested in their homelands, including in Arkansas, and enjoy coming back to Arkansas when they can. Caddos continue their cultural traditions. They continue these traditions through song, through dance, through language, through community, through art, and continue these cultural traditions. So next slide. I have some resources for you if you want to learn more, and I'm happy to answer questions that you might have of me now.
So we'll have questions from the audience, and then we also have some online questions, perhaps. So we'll open the floor to y'all.
The Jones Mill site open to the public?
The what?
The Jones Mill site?
It is on private land, so no, it's not.
Martin Marietta?
What?
Is that the Martin Marietta thing?
It is, no, it's on, closer to the Ouachita River, because it's on private land, so it's not open to the public. I have web pages that you can visit to learn about the research there, but it's, if you walk onto the property, what you're gonna see is an open field. So not much to look at there if you go visit. Most of the archaeological sites that we have that are publicly interpreted, like in state parks, there's something that you can see, like mounds, or in the case of historic Washington, buildings. So a lot of archaeological sites are, the interesting stuff is below ground, and there's not so much to see if you go there.
Mounds on private property, what's the Arkansas regulations or whatever?
The state laws have to do with burials and cemeteries. So unmarked cemeteries as well as marked cemeteries are protected under Arkansas law. So disturbing graves is against the law, and that's the main concern. For landowners who want to protect mounds and other archaeological sites on their property, the kind of depend on trespass laws. You can't trespass on someone's property to protect those sites from people coming in and digging holes and stuff.
When it came to the Caddos, you speak of them having that settlement that the Spanish found. Were there still nomadic, were there still areas where there were Caddo nomads, or were they established there specifically?
They, by that time period, people were living in settled communities. I mean, there were groups that would go off hunting, like today, just shooting deer from your back porch. You go out to your hunt camp. So there were hunting expeditions and stuff like that. But people, for the most part, lived in settled communities. These communities for the Caddo were spread out, so they weren't all in one place. People had a knowledge of a larger territory that they would have claimed as their place. That would have included things like nut groves and good fishing spots and that sort of thing.
Okay, so they still had plenty of villages, but they were for the most part settled in one area? Well,
Settled in one spot, but across a big area.
Oh yes, across a big area.
Yeah.
But as far as that, they wouldn't travel outward.
There were established trade routes, and there were established routes of transportation. Nowadays we have I-30 going up from Texarkana to Little Rock. That follows what in previous centuries was the old military road, and that follows what in previous centuries were native roads that were trails, roads that were used, connecting communities. So, people did move around, people had knowledge of the area, Going back into the Archaic period, people are moving around, moving resources around across a big area, a long time.
Do you think the Caddo in this area would have used the hot springs for medicinal purposes? Is there any record of that?
They may have. It is there's not a whole lot of oral tradition that I've heard about the hot springs in particular. There's certainly a lot of oral tradition in the historic period. More recently, the oral and written tradition that talks about use in the past. But whether the native people were using it the same way, I don't know. There were several people here, and it was one of the resources that we used. I don't know if it was as big a focus as it became later.
We didn't have any online questions, but we had a viewer tune in from Binger, Oklahoma.
Oh,
So
okay.
this caught their attention.
You mentioned the Adair site, which is under the water at the moment. And are there, would this specific area, like in the hot springs, close proximity, would it have been beneficial for long-term use? Is that what does the Jones Mill site tell us, that people have been living in almost immediate proximity to the hot springs area for a long time? Or is this less useful for another period?
It is, we have a number of these sites in the hot springs area that were used over thousands of years. We have a record of people living there going back to 8500 BC. So they're what we do call persistent places. They're places where people lived or came back to again and again and again over thousands of years, because they're good places to live. The river is right there. There's a variety of resources. You've got toolstone up on the mountain ridge. You've got fish in the river. You've got deer. all over the place, especially if you're growing crops, you're attracting them right into your backyard. These are good places to live, and we still live here today. So these are places where it is desirable to live, yes. We've got long histories of use of some of these sites. Some have been greatly impacted by modern development, covered over with dammed up rivers, but some of them still exist. They show us this record in the record.
I had some property out on Caddo Road in Mondale. My husband found this, after that big flood, like where all these people lost their lives out in.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And it's just amazing that you can find something like that. I asked you back in 2017 you studied, and you said, because I said, well, how old do you think that point could be? And I thought you said something BC. And I don't know, what is your, I should have written it down back then.
Yeah, it is a style that we see here, 2000 BC. And it is, yes, it's made by all back, right?
My daughter-in-law, they just recently found these to my son.
Mhm.
And on her property, and it's just amazing. to think
This
that
one
it's
is
still
older.
there.
This one is style that we see during the Woodland time period, so 1000 BC to 1080-ish. And yeah, but actually, it's good stuff.
Thank you very much.
So I brought some artifacts in from the station. I brought some pieces of pottery from this area. There's some charred corn cobs from the Stanford site, charred nuts, some grass and grass dog, and I brought the birds of this dog or Clovis point.
It sounds like we're about to transition into the show and tell portion. Just to let y'all know that next month we'll have, again, fourth Wednesday, noon here at the library. We will have Dr. Andrew Milson talking about the Hunter and Dunbar expedition. So essentially what you're experiencing is we're in America's 250th birthday year, and we have three sort of main themes that we're doing here in Hot Springs at National Park. It's going to end with parks today, parks tomorrow. That's what you're going to hear at the end of the year. In the middle of the year, you're going to hear about how Hot Springs contributed to the American story as a health and leisure destination in the national park. But the first portion of our year has been the deep history of this region. And so we just thank you again for telling us how we can learn more about the deep history of this region. So.
Thank you.